My prayer is that this will whet your appetite. This will encourage you to actually want to go home and carefully read the book of Esther. Go home, because what I'm doing is an overview. It's like an umbrella. But I hope that this makes it alive and it kind of breathes some life into it. So when you go home, you have a greater appreciation of what you're reading here. So the book of Esther, right? So if you find the book of Psalms, look right in the middle. You see Psalms, and then you take a left. And then there's a guy named Job. You may have heard of Job. And then right before that, the book of Esther. All right? It is short. And one of the things to remember is, like, when you read the book of Esther, it's got 10 chapters, but they're short. It's not a long, so you can probably read it in well under an hour, probably closer to 45 minutes. But I'm hoping that you, and as I read, I like to highlight. Man, I can't talk either. Yes, I highlight it. But I like to grab my gel highlighter, and I like to hit it, and it brings it alive. And for one thing, it slows me down. And so as we go through this, one of the things I want you to recognize is that this time, this is the largest empire on the earth, okay? The Persian Empire was massive. If you look way right, you see India. You may have heard of that. And then if you look to the left, you got Egypt. This is a massive, huge. They figured there was about 50 million people at that time that lived in this area. So if you got 50 million people, and the king was going to be looking for a new wife, and so they were looking at about 25 million women. And so he had quite a choice, yeah? And he's supposed to pick one, and just for the overview, he's supposed to pick one woman out of 25 million. And the one that he picks is an exile. She is a Jew, which is hated, terrible anti-Semitic problem there. And so here you've got, he picks the one orphan, her parents are dead, exiled, she's from Israel. And so you start looking at the odds. This is a God thing from the word get-go. The map just, to me, shows, it like puts a magnifying glass on what an amazing miracle this was that Esther was chosen. All right? So, I'm just going to give you a picture. And then we're going to get going here. So, the book of Esther. I love this. I think if we do this is about 480 before Christ, 480 years before Christ. And I want you to picture this. Because I'm going to go back. I like that picture. This helps. And so basically, the king of Persia is convinced that he's got this mighty army and he is going to go conquer Greece. He wants the Grecians. And so his big plan is he wants to, okay, I'll just tell you the story. He wants to build a bridge, and a series of bridges that'll take him over into Greece. So then he can march his army over into Greece. And when he marches over into Greece, he will conquer him. He's confident, he's successful. And so this get-together, this summit meeting in the first chapter of Esther is actually a war party. He's bringing together his leaders, he's bringing people together, and he's bringing them, and he says, okay, we're going to plan this, and we're going to execute this. And he's got engineers set up who are doing nothing but designing and building this series of bridges. And so he is really excited. And at the end of the war summit, they have a 7-day feast, a 7-day drunk, basically. And so right about this time, if you look back, Herodias, and there are some secular historians at this time, that said there was a terrible storm. And in this terrible storm, all the bridges are wiped out. And so when all the bridges are wiped out, the king here, King Xerxes, has got an anger management issue. He doesn't have very good impulse control. And so he is known in history as a very angry man. And by the way, he is not a good guy. Don't try and paint the king as a very sweet, kind guy. He was not. And so the king is very, very, very angry. And so he decides that the best thing he can do is take his army and give them whips. And so he marched his army down into the water and made them whip the water 300 times, punishing the water for taking out his bridges. He's not done. So then he takes branding irons, red hot branding irons, and marches his army down the water and sticks it in the water to brand the water. because he's so mad, he's just furious, and then he's not done. So then he takes his army and says, go kill all the engineers that were associated with building these bridges, because it is their fault that they're gone. If they had built better bridges, they wouldn't have washed out. So basically, this kind of gives you a flavor of what kind of guy we're dealing with here. Actually, he's a lot worse than that, but he's not, in my book, he wasn't really stable, okay? And so here, he's got, as you read the first chapter of Esther, this whole thing is, it's bad, okay? They've been together for 6 months, and they're planning this great invasion that's going to be unsuccessful. And so then, what happens? He says, okay, he says, I am going to offer the very best wine we have, and it actually says the abundance of royal wine, and to show the king's generosity, the king issued an edict saying no limits are to be placed on the drinking. And then it says, verse 8, that they were all served each man as much as he wanted. All right, so what kind of wisdom do you think is flowing out of this? Do you think he's getting great counsel from people, and he is surrounding himself by people that can't set up? And so here he says, at the same time, Queen Vashti was giving a banquet for the women in the royal palace for King Xerxes. And then on the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of too much wine, he told basically what he said, bring Queen Vashti out here, and because I want everybody to look how beautiful she is. I want to flaunt my queen. Now, historians aren't sure why she said no. She was not excited about this proposition. A majority of them think that she was pregnant. She had a son shortly after all this. Some think she was pregnant. Some think, there's a lot of things with all the debauchery going on, and she just didn't want nothing to do with it, and she was mad at her husband. I know that's hard to believe, but she was. And so she just said no. And then in verse 12, it says she refused to come out, and this made the king furious. Well, we just saw what happens when the king gets furious. He just whipped the water. Okay, so then now he's burning with anger, it says. He immediately consulted with his wise advisors, who are, as we call today, two sheets to the wind. Okay, and so here he's getting his wise advisors, who knew all the laws and customs, and he wanted their advice on how best to deal with his rebellious wife. All right, and so they met. These guys gave him great counsel. And so the king says in verse 15, so what are we going to do with my wife who's not obeying me? And so what can I do to her? In verse 16, they said, well, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but every noble and citizen in the whole empire. Why? Because women everywhere are going to learn to despise their husbands when they learn what Queen Vashti has refused to appear. They're like, listen, this is going to spread like a cancer. I mean, we cannot allow this to happen, because next thing you know, when they find out the queen isn't obeying her husband, that means every guy in the kingdom is going to lose control of their wives. You know, you should be laughing at this point. And so, if it please the king, we'd suggest you issue a decree, and it cannot be revoked. When it is decreed of the Medes and Persians, it cannot be revoked. It is set in stone. The king cannot turn it over. Nobody can turn it over. And the king says, I'm going to choose another queen. So that's the big plan. Choose another queen. So it says when the decree is published throughout the kingdom, verse 20, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. Because everybody knows you can legislate respect from your wives, right? Yeah, that works really, really well. And so the king and the nobles thought this made good sense. Of course it did, they're drunk. And so they followed, and they sent letters to everywhere. And the last part of verse 22, that every man should be the ruler of his own home. Does that sound like Fred Flintstone? Remember the old, I am king of my cave and I reign supreme. So that was the plan here. All right, so we made it all the way through the first chapter. But after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began thinking. See, that is just the first problem. The King Xerxes should not be thinking. I mean, that just doesn't work for him. He got thinking about Vashti and what she had done, the proclamation, and his personal attendant suggested, search the empire and find beautiful women. Now, before you get to thinking that this was a noble quest, history, the secular history says that he harvested 400 virgins from among his 25 million women, that he took in about 400 of them to his harem. And so, he's got a herd of them, and he brings them into his harem, and the whole thing lasts about a year where they're grooming them, and it is a mess, all right? And so, make a long story really short, moving through this, when it was all said and done, he chooses Esther. Now that is a miracle. That is an absolute fascinating miracle. 25 million people over this massive land. He chooses, I mean, these guys hate the Jews. There's an anti-Semitic movement, as we're going to see, that's terrible. So he actually chooses a Jew who's an orphan. And I know, Randy, I'm sorry. Here he is. He's going north. So anyways, the bee's busy. So anyways, if you run your finger, Esther chapter 2 and verse 10, it said Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to. All right? Because if they found out she was a Jew, that would have offset this whole thing and it wouldn't have turned out well. So Mordecai, who's her older cousin, that when her parents died, had basically adopted her and raised her. So her older cousin is the one here that's a major player. So you got Mordecai, her cousin, that raised her. You got Esther, she's the very young gal chosen to be queen. And then you got Xerxes, the king. Here's your three players, okay? And so as we run our fingers through here, you got to read this at home because this is a fascinating story. And in chapter 2, verse 17 says, the king loved Esther more than any of the other women, any of the other 400 he'd chosen. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. Oh man, this is like, you couldn't make this up. This is like history here. And so chapter 2, verse 20, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions. It reminds me of the New Testament where Jesus kept telling people, don't let anybody know what's going on. Don't tell people because, quote, my time has not yet come, right? And so God is, man, Esther, she is in a heathen palace. She is separated from everything she knows, and she is listening to Mordecai giving her counsel. He says, do not tell them who you are until God is ready for that to be revealed. So then the story gets interesting. Chapter 2 and verse 21. So one day Mordecai, he's on duty at the king's gates. Now, Mordecai has got some sort of position at the gates of and it is believed, and some of the history believes that this is like a position of like a, we call them court commissioners here. They're not actually judges, but people will come before them with land disputes, or people will come and they will issue wisdom and decisions, and they'll kind of give insight into things. And so whatever it was at that time,
they would just sit at the gate, right?
Yeah, he'd sit at the gate. People would bring their problems to him, and he would listen to the problems and tell them to get a life. And so he would sit there, and they would bring their problems to him, and he would dispense wisdom. But he could also keep tabs on Esther. He could find out what was going on with Esther and communicate with her a little bit. And so while he's sitting here, he overhears two of the king's guards. This is like his secret service. He overhears two of the king's closest guards angry with him because, well, we don't know why they're angry with the king, but it is believed popularly that they were mad because of how the queen treated Vashti. Maybe because they were the king's close guards and they knew Vashti, and so the king banished her, and she could never the rest of her life come into his presence. Maybe they were really upset because how the king treated her. And so here we've got, man, this just gets better and better. So Mordecai says, I have an assassination plot that I just heard about. So he tells Esther, Esther tells, and next thing you know, these two guys are executed. Yeah. Well,
and they document it.
Yeah, and if you look at the very last verse in chapter 2, it says this was all recorded in the book of history in King Xerxes' reign. This is huge. This is going to come into play a little bit later. The Persians were famous for writing everything down. They were famous. What we know about them is extensive because they kept very, very articulate notes on what was happening. So, chapter 3, Haman's plot to kill the Jews. At the same time, King Xerxes promoted Haman. Oh, here's our fourth player. Haman now enters the pictures. Now, I'm going to take a minute to tell you about Haman, because you miss out a lot if you just read it and you don't study it out, because this is interesting. Why is Haman a rabid dog when it comes to Jews? When it comes to the Jews, Haman has a deep-seated hatred for them, and it says that Haman was an Agagite. There in verse 1. All right, well, the thing is, so what happened was, if you go back 1,000 years, we got the Exodus from Egypt, and Exodus chapter 17, somewhere in there, the Jews were attacked by the Amalekites, all right? And the Amalekites are descendants of a guy named Esau. You may have heard of him. He sold his birthright. So the Amalekites are descendants of Esau, and so the Amalekites attacked the Jews. And so God was not happy with the Amalekites for attacking the Jews. And that offended him. So he said, basically, your nation is not going to survive, and your whole nation is going to become extinct. Fast forward 4 centuries. 4 centuries later, there's a guy named King Saul. You may have heard of King Saul. Well, King Saul conquered the Amalekites. It's happening, exactly like God said. In 1 Samuel, Saul captures the king, Agag. Captures him. And so God says, kill him. God had commanded, 4 centuries earlier that he's going to wipe him out. He said, Saul, wipe him out. Kill the king. But Saul's like, I don't want to do that. So Saul rebelled against God, displeased God. And so then there's a guy named Samuel, the prophet Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 15. He comes along, the Bible says he hacked King Agag to death. Basically, the preacher said, if you're not willing to do it, I'm going to do it. So prophet Samuel kills Agag. All right, Haman was a descendant of Agag. Mm-hmm. All right, now we're talking a lot of years. There are hundreds and hundreds of years have passed since Samuel killed Agag, yet Haman knew his family's history. And Haman knew that Samuel had killed one of his ancestors. Worse, Mordecai, who refuses to bow down to Haman, this very important guy, refuses to pay him homage and respect him, is what? Mordecai was a descendant of Kish. All right? Now you find that in chapter 2, verse 5. Kish is what? The tribe of Benjamin. And so what? Benjamin is the line of, say Saul. Yeah, it's the line of Saul. There's huge, deep-seated animosity between the descendants of Saul and the descendants of Agag because Saul refused to do what God told him to do. And so Haman, he's now been elevated to like number 2 guy in the kingdom. And Haman is so important that when he walks down the street, if you saw him, you're supposed to bow to him. You're supposed to pay him great respect. He comes to Mordecai, and Mordecai's like, ain't doing it, don't respect you, not going to do it, I only bow to God. And what this feud that started centuries before is now continuing. And so Haman, and don't be confused here, this is not a right versus left kind of thing. It's not, no, this is good versus evil, okay? This is good versus evil. Satan put in Haman's heart to exterminate all the Jews. He said, listen, the only way you're going to solve this is if you just kill all the Jews, and then this long-seated running feud with these guys are going to be over. Does that sound familiar? Because this started clear back in Genesis. Satan has always been determined to wipe out the Jewish nation. The anti-Semitic thing, do not get to thinking it's politics. It's not. It's evil. I mean,
the line of the seed of the Messiah.
Yeah, yes, it was a line of the Messiah was going to come through. There's tons of prophecy that involves the Jews. And so when we get going here, all of a sudden you realize there are layers of spiritual warfare going on here, dimensions of spiritual warfare that can be missed if you're not careful. All right? So Haman goes to the king in chapter 3 and says, listen, okay, now don't miss this, because Haman is slick. Haman goes to the king, and you already know the king is kind of he's not a good guy. He goes to the king and says, listen, there are some people in your land that wants to overthrow you. There's some people in this land, they're like rebelling, and they're trying to raise up people against you, and they don't follow your laws, they don't respect your laws, and not only that, they're very wealthy. So if we kill all these people that are trying to overthrow you, we can grab their property and all their stuff. And remember, he had just got beaten in a war. He had just spent a ton of money on a battle that he lost. And so what happens here? Now he is broke anyway, so he's like, listen, you want to fill your coffers? Here's how you can fill your coffers: kill all the Jews and take their stuff. Hitler did the same thing. So as we keep going here, he said, listen, you can kill him. So what does the king do in verse 10? He confirms by removing his ring and giving it to Haman. And Haman now has control of exterminating the Jew. We have a Holocaust thing going on. And the king said, quote, the money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit. Oh, man. So this just gets going. And so Haman issues a proclamation. It's sent throughout the land. They got a day. They got a time. They're going to exterminate the Jews. And so...
And he's happy with himself.
Haman has an ego that is this big. Haman's ego, and by the way, that should be the 5th person in the story. You know, you've got the 4 major players, and then you got Haman's ego. And Haman's ego is a huge player in this story. And so the decree is sent out, chapter 4. So Mordecai requests Esther's help. So Mordecai, but don't you love how God moves the chess pieces around? God looks down the tunnel of time. He sees a threat coming. He sees what's going to happen. We know that Israel is the land of promise, the people of God's promise with Abraham. And so as we look at all this, we recognize what? God has got everybody in position right where he wants them. So chapter 4. When Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap, and went into the city, crying and wailing. He went out, and what is he doing? He is publicly wailing. He is publicly grieving. He is not hiding this. And he went so far as the gate of the palace, and no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as the news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews, because what? The Holocaust wheels have been put in motion here. And so basically, Queen gets word of what's going to happen, and this whole thing is awful. So she basically, Esther here, she tells her, the guy that's taking care of him, she says, I want you to go out, talk to my cousin, talk to Mordecai, and he's going to give you a scoop, because I want to know exactly what is going on here. I want the truth. So verse 7, Mordecai told him the whole story, including the amount of money Haman had been promised to hand over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes. Okay, this is a great part of the story. Can't miss this. And so what happens here is Mordecai tells the whole story. He says, all right, here's what's happening. He says, Haman wants to kill all the Jews, right? And so all of a sudden, one night, the king can't sleep. And as the king can't sleep, what happens? He has insomnia, and he's trashing around. And so what does he do? If you can't sleep, you try counting sheep. If that doesn't work, you read the phone book. If that doesn't work, well, you read the record of the king's actions from the king Artaxerxes, because that'll put you to sleep faster than anything. Read some political, watch C-SPAN. That'll put you out like a light. And so the king says, okay, read to me from the book. And so they come in and they start reading from the book. And as they read from the book, what happens? All of a sudden the king says, wait a minute, what about Mordecai? What did we do for Mordecai for saving my life? They're like, well, according to the record, you didn't do anything for him. He saved your life and you ignored him. The king says, well, that's not good. So, make a long story short, Haman comes before the king. And the king says, listen, if there was a man that did something absolutely remarkable, somebody that I respected, somebody that's just an incredible person, and I want to honor him in a great way, what should we do? Well, you know what Haman says? It's me. The king is so impressed with me, he wants to do something great for me. And so Haman is like, well, I'd put robes on him, and I'd have a parade, and so Haman is like, yeah, he is letting his mind go wild, saying, man, whatever is just great and wonderful, I want that done to me, because I am like awesome. And the king finally recognizes it, and he wants to recognize me, and so the king says,
and don't forget, you want one of your high noblemen to go in front of the board to proclaim the greatness of the guy.
Yeah, I want a high nobleman to go in front of me and proclaim that I'm the greatest guy that ever lived. And so the king looks over at Haman and says, do that for Mordecai.
And you go lead his woman.
I bet he cried. I bet in his heart he was just, because he come to the king to have him killed, and now the king wants him, and so king said, and you go out in front of him and proclaim what a great guy he is. Now Haman's whole plan is falling apart. The best laid plans. Remember the old saying, if you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans. Well, Haman is a personal illustration of this, okay? So this whole thing is just falling apart. All right. So then, let me go back to our verse we started with. All right, chapter 4, verse 14, right here on the screen. For if you remain silent, this is Mordecai talking to Esther. He says, listen, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Don't you love that? God looked there and said, listen, God put you right where you are for the purpose of saving your people. And there's something I take away from this, and at the risk of going into another sermon. If you refuse to obey God, if you refuse to do what God wants you to do, he will plug somebody else in and they will get the blessing. God's will is not averted just because I refuse to cooperate with him. just because I refuse to yield or submit or obey him does not mean that his will is going to be derailed, okay?
Ask Jonah.
Yeah, ask Jonah. Yeah. So he said, listen, God put you right where you're at. What are you going to do about this? It's time to reveal your nationality. So what is, I love Queen Esther. Chapter 4, verse 15. So Esther simply replied to Mordecai, we'll gather all the Jews and do a fast. Don't eat or drink for 3 days and nights. And we're going to do this. She said, listen, it's time to hit our knees. Why? And this gets better. Because you remember Vashti? Remember the queen? Well, the queen violated a protocol. The protocol was if the king called for you, you went. You didn't get to say no. So she knows that the king is very strict when it comes to protocols. And so here, if you go in front of the king and you're not summoned, he can kill you right on the spot. I mean, we're talking, they take this very seriously. If you're to go in front of the king, another thing, you're not supposed to look sad. If you go in front of the king, you're supposed to look happy. And if you go in front of the king, you can only go if he summons you. And so now, Mordecai, her cousin, wants her to go in front of the king unbidden. And when she goes in front of the king, she's going to march in there, and she's sad because the king just said he's going to kill all her people, and she's going to go in there, and she's going to tell him, well, I'm one of them people. And so all she sees here is, death and doom and destruction here. This is so not going to end well. I'm going to end up worse than Vashti. Yeah, Vashti got the bad end of the deal, and I'm about to get a shorter end of the stick, okay? And so she said, we're going to pray about this, We're going to call God's 911. We want him to listen up here. So chapter 5. All right, so on the third day of the fast, Esther puts on her royal robes and enters the inner court of the palace and across from the king's hall. And the king is sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. And when he saw Queen Esther standing there, this is a moment of truth. He sees the queen standing in the inner court. He welcomed her and held out the golden scepter to her. And Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. And the king asked her, what you want, Esther? What's your request? I'll give it to you, even if it's half of the... Now, this is a guy that is in love with the queen. She has him wrapped around her finger. All right, and so Esther says, well, to please the king. Now, she had a plan. She's supposed to go in there and tell the king, say, listen, you're going to kill all the Jews, and I'm included, except God gives us wisdom when we need it. And so here in chapter 5 and verse 5, she said, listen, new plan. Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet. And listen, we're going to throw a banquet. It's just going to be the king and the queen and Haman. And this is one of the greatest honors you can bestow on somebody. Haman still thinks that, he's top dog here. So he still thinks that, he's in the king's favor. And so he doesn't think the king realized how this is all going to shake out. And so she said, listen, let's just throw a banquet. Just the three of us. And we're going to see what God wants to do, basically. And so while they're drinking, the king says to Esther, tell me what you really want, what's your request, I'll give it to you, even half the kingdom. And Esther said, this is my request, my deepest wish. If I found favor with the king, if it pleases the king, grant my request. Do what I ask, please. Come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet. And I'll prepare it, and I'll explain to you what this is all about. So here's her plan, last line. She said, we're all going to have a banquet, and then I'm going to sit down, and I am going to confront Haman in front of the king about this decree to kill all my people. So Haman's a happy man. He left the banquet. And why? Because his ego is being pumped up again. Haman thinks the whole world is just going to realize what a great guy I am. And so he sees Mordecai sitting at the palace, not standing up, and he's furious. And he goes home and he's mad. And he complains to his wife and his friends and everybody. And he's complaining about how bad Mordecai is. And let's keep going. Chapter 6. Got to turn the paper. Chapter 6. Haman's downfall. All right, so this is a little out of order. Chapter 6 is where the king had insomnia, couldn't sleep, read the orders, gave the command for Mordecai to be rewarded. All right? So at the end of chapter 6, it says, and while they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. Wow. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, they were drinking wine, and the king said to Esther, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request, and I'll give it to you, even half the kingdom. Verse 3, Queen Esther replied, if I found favor with the king, if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people be spared. She did it. She waited for God. God opened the doors. She said, "For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would remain quiet. For that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." And the king was like, who would do such a thing? Who's going to kill my queen, right? Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Now, at this point, don't you think Haman feels a little sick? Haman realizes that everything she's doing is painting him in a bad light. Verse 6, and Esther said, "This wicked man, Haman, is our adversary and our enemy." And Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. And then the king jumped to his feet in a rage, and we already know how the king is when he's raging, right? That's exciting. And so he went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind. And by the way, John Wayne couldn't draft this any better, okay? So here, you've got Haman staying behind with the queen. He wants to plead for his life. So he throws himself on the floor, and he says he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was, reclining, and the king walks in the door at that exact moment, and he sees Haman on the couch, pleading for his life, and he thinks that Haman is assaulting the queen. So, this is like Dumb and Dumber. And so the king complained, "Will he even assault my queen right here in the palace before my eyes?" No, you can't dig a deeper hole at this point. Yeah.
You forgot about the part where Haman had a gallows beat for Mordecai to hang him from.
Oh, yes, yeah. Mordecai was so sure that Haman was so sure he's going to kill Mordecai that he actually had gallows built. So he got these huge gallows built in a public place so Haman can hang Mordecai publicly and get his revenge against this guy that won't bow down to him. So the king exclaimed, "Will he assault the queen right here in the palace?" And so as soon as the king spoke, the attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. And so one of the king's eunuchs said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole to stand 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. And he intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." And so what does the king say? "Impale Haman on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he set up for Mordecai. And the king's anger was subsided. Yeah, he felt better about himself. Yeah. He's a very unique guy. Chapter 8. All right, so on the same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Well, he's a wealthy guy. He's number 2. He's like vice president, prime minister, whatever you want to call him. He is the next guy behind the king. He's got great wealth. It all goes to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. So the king took off his signet ring again, but he's more careful what he does with it now, which he had taken off and gave it to Haman and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. Now we have a property manager. And so Esther went again before the king, falling down at his feet, begging him with tears to stop this evil plot designed by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and she rose and stood before him. And Esther said in verse 5, "If it please the king, and I found favor with him, and if he thinks it's right, and if I'm pleasing to him, let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman's son." Well, the problem is, the law of I call them the mean Persians. The mean Persians cannot be returned. All right, they can't turn it over. They can't revoke it. It can't. So what does he do? So the king says, "Well, what am I going to do here?" So basically making the story, trimming it down, the king says, "Listen, I can't overturn my initial order, but I can give the Jews permission to defend themselves. So if anybody comes to kill them, arrest them, and do all this, I am going to give the Jews the authority to take whatever necessary to defend themselves. Hence, therefore, nobody attacks the Jews," right? So the king had actually found a weasel clause that protected the Jews here. So verse 11 of chapter 8, the king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite and defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality, any province who might attack them or their children or their wives and take their property. Okay, give them a lot of authority. And so this is like a huge day of deliverance, all right? It went out, and then verse 15, "Then Mordecai left the king's presence wearing the royal robe of blue and white, and the great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated this new decree, and they were filled with gladness." So then this is where it gets kind of interesting. In verse 17, "In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced at a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday." Purim. Yeah. And so it is a celebration, a 2-day celebration, a festival of deliverance. They were saved. Chapter 9, on March 7th, 2 decrees of the king were put into effect on that day. The enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but it had the opposite effect, right? Opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their city. And by the way, I hope you realize that there's some lessons here that transcend history. God will protect his people. Throughout the beginning, Satan has tried to annihilate the Jews, the nation of Israel. And throughout history, it has failed. And throughout history, it has failed. I mean, 7-day war, and you can keep going. Miracles have been performed that defies logic, defies explanation. God protects his people, and he will continue to protect his people. And what can man do unto me? So anyway, I'm hoping that this creates a hunger for you to know more. Chapter 9, verse 20. And Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the province of King Xerxes, calling them to celebrate an annual festival on 2 days. And he told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness, giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. And this would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned to gladness and their mourning into joy. Verse 23, the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal, adopted this animal custom. Oh, is this amazing? This is a wonderful story. And to me, it's faith building. Esther is a person of faith who stepped out in faith and obeyed God's will. She had no idea what the outcome would be. She had no idea if the king was going to kill her. She had no idea when she stepped into the king's throne room. She did not know what was going to happen. That is called stepping by faith, taking a leap of faith. And let's see, chapter 10. The king further decrees and includes remarks. The king imposed a tribute throughout all his empire, even to the distant coast. And you got to remember, this is what makes this story incredibly. I started out by telling you what a difficult, terrible, anger-driven man this was, about how a man that had a terrible 7-day drunken feast and made bad decisions and allows his anger to control him, and he had no problem signing a Holocaust order. And now by the chapter 10, we see the king signing a tribute throughout all his empire, even to the distant coastlands, of his great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, who the king had recorded. And I love this. And that is recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. And Mordecai, the Jew, became the prime minister with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews, who held him in high regard because he had continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of their descendants. God, on the front of the table here, Genesis 50:20. What man intended for evil, God intended for good. You cannot look at this story and see what happened to Haman and say, man, the Jews are not going to survive this. They're going to be killed. They're going to be annihilated. This will be the end of the Hebrews. And all of a sudden you recognize God was not asleep. God was paying attention. He was waiting until the people he needed in those positions were there. He was waiting until their faith had grown to a point where they were able to act out of faith. He was waiting until the timing was perfect. And I will always the rest of my life love these two banquets. The first banquet, where Esther throws a banquet, she just wants the three of them there, and Haman is so excited, and something in Esther's heart says, no, don't do it yet, not yet, not yet. The king says, now what do you need? And she says, I want a second banquet. She throws a second banquet, and that's the one where God's okay, pull the trigger, make it happen. And so we get to the second banquet, and you see where everything is falling into play, and God's people are saved, and Esther is very faithful to God, and Mordecai, who never wavered from his love for God, is rewarded. I love this story. This is absolutely, and now the Jews have got an order allowing them to join together and protect themselves. So I gave you two themes at the bottom of your handout. One, God works subtly behind the scenes. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean that he's not working, right? And number two, Esther trusts God and lives and lives by faith. Esther trusts God. She looked and she says, And by the way, have you ever noticed that in these moments of great pressure, in moments of great darkness, in moments of great suffering, that is where it is revealed what you believe about God. What you, in your heart of hearts, believed about God is everything else is stripped away. And in that moment of terrible darkness, of terrible suffering, what you believe about God is revealed. And in that moment, you have choices to make, but in that moment, your faith grows. In that moment, God grows your faith. He brings you to a point where you say, I must rely on God. I must trust Him. I must trust who He is. And what happened? Esther chose to live by faith. Wow, what an incredible story. My prayer is that you want to go home. Yeah.
On your themes, God worked suitably behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So suitably that He wasn't named in the whole book of Esther.
Oh, no, this is a huge, by the way, you study this out. I love this. God is not mentioned. And by the way, what's interesting is when they call it canon. When the books are decided what should go in the Bible and what should not go in the Bible, the canonicity, what books are chosen, what books are not chosen, what should go in the Bible, what should not go in. When they hit Esther, God is not mentioned in the whole book. However, there was no argument.
Yeah.
The whole book is about God. The whole book is about God. And so when the guys that are sitting down looking at this saying, all right, canon, does Esther meet canon? Yeah, it goes. Yeah, that's it. Even though, why? Because you cannot read Esther and not see the hand of God, His fingerprints on every aspect of this whole thing working.
Incredible.
God moving behind the scenes. Thank you. That is an incredibly insightful area.